Welcome everybody to Bible Bites. I'm Pastor Dan. We are reading through the Bible one small bite at a time. We are going to pick up in Matthew chapter 11, having finished chapter 10 in our last video. All of chapter 10 was Jesus' instructions to his disciples before he was going to send them out into the towns and villages of Israel to proclaim the good news of the kingdom. So let's begin reading. When Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and preach in their cities. So not only did Jesus send out his 12, but he then went into these various cities to preach and teach. He was teaching and preaching the same message, the kingdom of God, the good news of God's kingdom. Now, when John heard in prison about the deeds of the Christ, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, "Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another?" This is John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin, but the one whom the Old Testament prophesied about, that he would come to prepare the way of the Lord. This means that he would prepare people's hearts and minds to receive Jesus, to actually receive the teaching also of Jesus, the good news. And John was at this time in prison. And in this day, when you were in prison, you really didn't have access to anything unless it was provided to you by those on the outside. Even food, you really didn't have much access to food. It is possible that the Roman government may give you some kind of provision just to keep you alive, but it probably wasn't much, even maybe enough to even sustain you. So John's rotting in prison, and when we face these circumstances in our lives where the expectations we have of God aren't being met, or things or God isn't doing what we meeting the expectations even in the way that we thought he would. But doubts begin to creep in, right? When our circumstances are rough. And it was no joyride of being in prison. This was, when I say rotting in prison, that's literally a good description of it. And John may very well have known that his situation would probably end up leading to death, and which it did. So John sends his disciples to Jesus and just says, "Hey, ask Jesus, is he the one?" John knew this early on in his ministry, but again, circumstances have a way of really helping us to, or casting doubt, and John was struggling. So he sends disciples to Jesus. And this is Jesus' response: "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them, and blessed is the one who is not offended by me." Jesus didn't come right out and say, "Yes, John, I'm the one." But instead, Jesus offered proof to John. He said, "Go back and tell John all these things. You know, the blind are receiving sight, that there's healings taking place, the poor are having God's good news preached to them, their lives are changing completely because of that." And John knew the Old Testament well, and he knew the many prophecies of the Old Testament about the Messiah. And so John would compare. He would say, okay, the Old Testament says that that when God's good news is preached and when the Messiah comes, that the lame are going to walk, that the poor are going to receive sight, that the blind are going to receive sight, and that the poor are going to rejoice and be rich because of God's good news. Not rich physically, but rich spiritually. Their whole lives would truly change as they began living for the kingdom, and as they began just rejoicing that they have access to God. So Jesus offered John real proof. John would compare these prophecies with what Jesus was actually doing. He would say yes. His heart would be consoled. He would rejoice again. He would be much encouraged by the proofs that Jesus offered. So, this is awesome start to the beginning of chapter 10. In our next video, Jesus will talk about John the Baptist to the crowds. So we'll pick up with that in our next video. See you then.